The political and military conditions that set the stage for the Battle of Lake Balaton in March 1945 were deeply rooted in both the wider course of the Second World War and the specific position of Hungary at that late stage of the conflict. By early 1945, the Red Army had advanced deep into Central Europe, having pushed German forces back through Belarus, Poland, and into the Carpathian Basin. The fall of Budapest on 13th February 1945 marked a major milestone. Soviet forces now held the Hungarian capital, and their front lines extended westward toward Austria. This placed them within striking distance of Vienna, a crucial German administrative and logistical hub. For Germany, Hungary remained significant far beyond its role as an ally. The country was home to the largest remaining European oil fields accessible to the Third Reich, located around Nagy Kanica in western Hungary. By 1945, the German war machine was heavily dependent on these supplies. Romanian oil fields had been lost in 1944, and synthetic fuel production was insufficient to cover operational needs. German High Command, under Adolf Hitler's direct orders, regarded the retention of Hungarian oil as essential for sustaining combat operations, particularly for panzer divisions that were still expected to resist the Soviet advance. Hungary itself was a contested ground both politically and militarily. Regent Miklós Horthy had been removed in October 1944 after attempting to negotiate with the Allies, replaced by the pro-German Arrow-Cross regime under Ferenc Szálasi. This government aligned itself fully with German objectives, committing Hungarian forces to joint operations. Yet, by early 1945, Hungarian society was exhausted. Cities had been heavily bombed, the countryside was disrupted by constant troop movements, and both German and Soviet requisitions drained food supplies. Civilian morale was low, but divisions of the Royal Hungarian Army still fought under German command structures. On the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin aimed to secure Austria and force a German retreat into the Alps. Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front was tasked with operations in western Hungary, while Marshal Rodion Malinovsky's Second Ukrainian Front maintained pressure further north. These forces had already demonstrated effective coordination in the capture of Budapest, and their lines of supply were stabilized through a combination of captured railways and Soviet logistical networks stretching back through Romania and Ukraine. Intelligence reports suggested that the Germans were still capable of local counterattacks, but the overall momentum clearly favored the Red Army. The balance of forces in early 1945 reflected this disparity. German Army Group South, reorganized after the Budapest campaign, numbered around 43,000 men, though many were understrength formations. Its armored component, however, was still considerable. Elite units such as the 6th SS Panzer Army, transferred from the Western Front after the Ardennes offensive, were deployed in Hungary. Equipped with Tiger IIs, Panthers, and assault guns, these formations represented some of the best remaining German armored strength. The Hungarian Third Army, although weakened, supplemented these forces with infantry and artillery. Opposing them, the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front fielded approximately 400,000 troops, supported by large numbers of tanks and self-propelled guns, primarily T-34-85s, Su-76, and IS-2s. The Red Army also benefited from extensive artillery and a robust air presence provided by the 17th Air Army. Romanian and Bulgarian units, now aligned with the Allies, were integrated into Soviet formations, adding further manpower. In contrast to the German reliance on dwindling resources, the Soviets enjoyed growing logistical security and industrial backing. The geopolitical context also influenced strategic decision-making. Hitler's insistence on holding Hungary was tied to both the oil fields and the symbolic value of resisting the Soviet advance into Austria. For Stalin, the prospect of reaching Vienna before Western Allied forces advanced through southern Germany carried enormous political weight. It would secure Soviet influence in Central Europe during post-war negotiations. Both leaders pressed their generals to act decisively, ensuring that the battles to come would be shaped not only by military calculations, but also by political imperatives. By February 1945, therefore, Hungary was poised for another major confrontation. German High Command prepared one final offensive in the region, hoping to regain control of vital oil fields and halt the Soviet advance. The Soviets, determined to secure their western flank and prepare for the assault on Austria, prepared defensive measures in anticipation of such a strike. Into this tense environment unfolded the Battle of Lake Balaton, the last large-scale German offensive of the war, conceived as Hitler's final gamble in Hungary. The German offensive, known as Operation Frühlingserwachen, or Spring Awakening, opened in the early hours of 6th March 1945. Its primary striking force, the 6th SS Panzer Army under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich, was deployed west of the Danube near Lake Balaton. This army, fresh from the Ardennes campaign, still included some of the most powerful units the Wehrmacht could field, notably OISS Panzer Corps and 2 SS Panzer Corps, equipped with Tiger IIs, Panthers, and Panzer IVs. Their mission was ambitious: to break through Soviet lines, advance southeast toward the Danube, secure the oil-producing areas around Nagy-Kanisa, and drive the Red Army back from western Hungary. On the Soviet side, Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front was spread across defensive positions extending from Lake Balaton north toward Székesfehérvár and east into the approaches of Budapest. Tolbukhin had received intelligence from reconnaissance flights and partisan activity suggesting a German buildup, but the timing and scale of the offensive were uncertain. Expecting a possible counterstroke, the Soviets had fortified their positions with minefields, artillery concentrations, and anti-tank barriers. The 4th Guards Army, 26th Army, and 27th Army formed the main defensive front, supported by mechanized reserves positioned to counter breakthroughs. The initial German assault began with concentrated artillery fire, followed by armored thrusts aimed at narrow sectors of the Soviet line. The main weight of the attack fell near Székesfehérvár, where German SS Panzer divisions attempted to force a corridor through the defenses. Terrain played a decisive role. The region south of Lake Balaton was marshy, waterlogged from spring thaw, and poorly suited for heavy armor. German units frequently found themselves bogged down, with Tigers and Panthers immobilized in mud or stuck on narrow roads. Despite these difficulties, the early hours saw localized successes, as Soviet forward positions were overrun and some villages captured. Soviet resistance was stiff. Infantry units of the 26th Army absorbed the shock and quickly called in artillery support, which saturated advancing German armor. Air battles broke out overhead as the Luftwaffe attempted to support the offensive with fighter bombers, while the Soviet 17th Air Army committed large numbers of Il-2 ground attack aircraft. Although German tanks inflicted heavy losses in direct engagements, the Red Army's depth of defense prevented a breakthrough. Civilians in the region found themselves caught in the midst of sudden violence. Villages near the front line were evacuated under Soviet orders, while others fled westward, fearing reoccupation by German and Hungarian forces. Roads became crowded with columns of troops, refugees, and supply vehicles. The Hungarian population, already suffering from years of war and the devastation of the siege of Budapest, faced yet another round of fighting across their farmland and towns. Command tensions were evident from the start. Hitler had issued strict orders forbidding any withdrawal, requiring units to hold their positions at all costs. This clashed with the realities on the ground, where commanders struggled with terrain, fuel shortages, and logistical delays. Even elite formations such as the Leibstandarte and Das Reich divisions found themselves advancing slowly, sometimes only a few kilometers a day. In the first 3 days of the offensive, German forces captured a number of positions and pressed Soviet units back toward the Sarvis Canal, but the cost was significant, and the offensive lacked the rapid momentum seen in earlier years of the war. Soviet reserves, including the 18th Tank Corps and 1st Guards Mechanized Corps, were already moving into position to counterattack. By 9th of March, the Soviet High Command recognized that the German offensive was indeed a major operation, and not merely a local counterstroke. Orders were issued to reinforce defensive lines, concentrate artillery, and prepare for a counteroffensive once the German advance exhausted itself. The opening phase of Operation Frühlingserwachen, thus revealed both the determination of the German command to mount one final large-scale offensive and the resilience of Soviet forces, who anticipated a strike and had prepared to absorb the blow. The early days set the stage for an escalating confrontation. The Germans sought desperately to gain ground and secure oil, while the Soviets aimed to blunt the attack and prepare for a decisive response. What unfolded was a clash, shaped as much by terrain and logistics as by manpower and equipment, with both sides committing significant resources to a campaign whose outcome would determine the future of Hungary and the road to Vienna. The strategic goals and planning behind the Battle of Lake Balaton reveal the contrasting priorities of the German and Soviet commands in the early months of 1945. On the German side, Adolf Hitler himself played the decisive role in formulating the plan. In February, he ordered Army Group South, commanded by General Otto Wöhler, to launch a major counteroffensive to secure Hungary's oil reserves and prevent the Red Army from reaching Austria. The chosen name, Frühlingserwachen, Spring Awakening, reflected both political symbolism and desperation. The Führer hoped this operation would demonstrate to allies and enemies alike that Germany still possessed the capacity for offensive warfare. The 6th SS Panzer Army, transferred from the Western Front after the Ardennes offensive, was to spearhead the attack. Under SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich, the army consisted of elite Waffen-SS formations, including the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Hohenstaufen, and Hitlerjugend divisions. These units retained a formidable armored inventory, approximately 400 tanks and assault guns, including heavy Tiger IIs, supported by artillery and mechanized infantry. However, many of the soldiers were exhausted from the Ardennes campaign, and the logistical networks needed to sustain such an operation in Hungary were fragile. Fuel, ammunition, and spare parts had to be hauled over long distances, often across war-torn infrastructure. To supplement this armored fist, the German plan integrated elements of the Hungarian Third Army and other Wehrmacht units positioned around Lake Balaton. The operation envisioned three main thrusts: the primary attack by the 6th SS Panzer Army north of the lake towards Székesfehérvár, a secondary push by the 6th Army south of the lake toward Nagy Kaniza's oil fields, and diversionary attacks elsewhere to pin down Soviet forces. The overall aim was to drive a wedge into the Soviet front, recapture vital resources, and stabilize the collapsing Eastern Front. The Soviets, however, had intelligence advantages that allowed them to anticipate the offensive. Through reconnaissance flights, intercepted communications, and partisan reports, Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin of the 3rd Ukrainian Front became aware of German preparations. Soviet intelligence accurately identified the concentration of armored units and predicted an attack in early March. As a result, Tolbukhin prepared a defense-in-depth system, supported by reserves ready to counterstrike once the German advance slowed. Soviet strength in the region was formidable. The 3rd Ukrainian Front fielded roughly 4,000 men, supported by around 7,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and nearly 400 tanks and self-propelled guns. Their armored forces included modernized T-34-85s, heavy IS-2 tanks, and Su-series assault guns. The Soviet 17th Air Army, equipped with Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft and fighters, ensured aerial superiority. Behind the front, Tolbukhin held the 9th Guards Army and several mechanized corps as a powerful counteroffensive reserve. The planning on the Soviet side emphasized attrition. Tolbukhin deliberately built heavily fortified defensive belts, mining key approaches, and preparing ambush positions for German armor. Soviet artillery was massed in depth, allowing flexible responses to penetration attempts. The operational logic was to allow the Germans to commit their elite forces, exhaust themselves against layered defenses, and then counterattack decisively once momentum had been lost. Political pressures also shaped these plans. Hitler's insistence on holding Hungary was motivated by both strategic and symbolic reasons. The loss of Romanian oil in 1944 had left Germany critically short of fuel, and Nagy Kaniza represented the last major source under Axis control, Moreover, he viewed Hungary as a buffer for Austria, whose capital, Vienna, was threatened by the Soviet advance. Conversely, Stalin pressed his commanders to secure Hungary quickly and open the path to Vienna. This urgency was not only military but also political, as the Red Army's progress into Central Europe would define post-war influence. Propaganda on both sides amplified these strategic imperatives. German broadcasts presented the offensive as proof of renewed strength, while Soviet media framed it as the last convulsions of the enemy. For Hungarian civilians, however, the planning meant yet another round of devastation. Both armies requisitioned food, transport, and housing. Fields were torn up for defensive works, livestock seized for rations, and villages prepared for evacuation. Logistical planning proved to be the greatest weakness of the German effort. Supplying heavy armored divisions in muddy spring terrain was a daunting challenge. Fuel shortages plagued the 6th SS Panzer Army from the outset, forcing tanks to halt while waiting for deliveries. Spare parts were equally scarce, leaving damaged vehicles abandoned after minor breakdowns. Soviet logistics, by contrast, were stretched but functional, supported by rail lines secured after the fall of Budapest. American Lend-Lease trucks provided mobility, and Soviet engineers quickly repaired infrastructure to maintain supply flows. In summary, the strategic planning behind the Battle of Lake Balaton was marked by asymmetry. Germany aimed for an ambitious breakthrough that would restore its strategic initiative and secure vital oil resources, but its capacity to sustain such an operation was fragile. The Soviets, aware of German intentions, prepared a defensive posture designed to absorb and blunt the blow, with the expectation that attrition would favor their superior resources. As the plans moved from paper to reality, the clash between desperation and calculated defense became inevitable, setting the stage for one of the final major offensives on the Eastern Front. The German offensive against Soviet positions around Lake Balaton began in the early hours of 6th of March 1945, when Operation Frühlingserwachen moved from planning to action. The weight of the initial attack fell upon the northern sector, where the 6th SS Panzer Army concentrated its armored formations. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and Hitler-Jugend divisions were directed towards Sekis-Fehérvár, with the goal of piercing Soviet lines and rolling up the defenses along the Sarviz Canal. The terrain, however, proved to be an obstacle as significant as any enemy formation. The spring thaw had transformed fields into expanses of mud, making maneuver difficult for the heavy Tiger IIs and Panthers. The Germans attempted to mitigate these conditions by concentrating on road networks and elevated ground, but this predictability allowed Soviet artillery to anticipate their movements. Soviet defenders from the 4th Guards Army and 26th Army had fortified villages, canals, and ridges into strongpoints. Anti-tank positions, often manned with 76mm and 85mm guns, were hidden along the likely avenues of approach. When the German armor moved forward, they were often met with concentrated fire, forcing them to halt, regroup, or find alternative paths that further delayed progress. Despite these challenges, the German divisions did manage some initial gains. By the evening of 7th of March, forward elements had penetrated several kilometers into Soviet territory, capturing villages and inflicting losses on isolated Soviet outposts. The presence of Waffen-SS units still carried psychological weight, and their use of well-coordinated armored and infantry assaults produced localized breakthroughs. However, progress was slower than planned, and every kilometer gained required significant expenditure of fuel and ammunition, resources Germany could scarcely afford. The southern sector saw the German 6th Army and Hungarian units attempting to advance toward the Nagy Kanisa oil fields. Here, too, swampy terrain and Soviet defenses limited momentum. The Hungarian 3rd Army fought alongside German divisions, often tasked with holding flanks or conducting diversionary attacks. Although Hungarian troops were familiar with the terrain, their equipment was outdated compared to both German and Soviet standards, and attrition mounted quickly. The Red Army absorbed the shock with relative cohesion. Soviet command anticipated the possibility of a major German thrust, and reserves had been placed in depth. The 27th Army and 57th Army were prepared to reinforce sectors under heavy pressure, Soviet artillery proved decisive in slowing German advances, particularly when German spearheads became channeled along narrow causeways or roads. The use of Katyusha rocket batteries added to the intensity of defensive fire, saturating areas where German armor attempted to regroup. Air power also played a significant role in the opening battles. The Luftwaffe deployed fighter bombers in an effort to disrupt Soviet supply lines and provide close support to advancing armor. However, the depleted state of German air forces was evident. Aircraft availability was limited. Fuel shortages curtailed operations, and losses quickly mounted. In contrast, the Soviet 17th Air Army maintained substantial presence over the battlefield. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft struck German armored concentrations and logistics hubs, while fighters ensured relative control of the skies. For the German armored divisions, this meant exposure to near-constant aerial harassment. The civilian population endured another wave of displacement as the battle unfolded. Villages near the front were either evacuated or became contested ground, with homes converted into defensive positions. Civilians were often forced to abandon possessions as they fled westward, while others remained under Soviet orders to support fortification work. Fields that had provided food supplies were churned into mud by tanks and artillery, creating additional hardship for a population already suffering from shortages. By 9th of March, the limits of the German advance were becoming apparent. The offensive had achieved some territorial gains and inflicted casualties, but it had not broken the Soviet line or captured Sekesfehervar. Instead, Soviet forces continued to trade space for time, drawing the Germans deeper into zones prepared for attrition. The German timetable, already tight due to fuel constraints and Hitler's rigid expectations, slipped further behind. The first engagements thus revealed the fundamental imbalance of the campaign. German armored units could still deliver concentrated blows and overrun local positions, but the depth of Soviet defenses, coupled with superior artillery and air support, prevented any decisive breakthrough. Both sides recognized that the battle was only beginning. For the Germans, the question was how long momentum could be sustained in the face of mounting logistical problems. For the Soviets, the task was to hold firm until reserves could be unleashed to counterattack. The opening clashes around Lake Balaton demonstrated the scale of resources still committed in 1945, even as Germany neared collapse. They also exposed the stark reality that terrain, weather, and supply shortages could blunt even elite formations. As the offensive pressed on, the confrontation expanded into a broader crisis, where operational ambitions collided with the hard limits of material strength and endurance. As the German offensive continued into its second week, the operation entered a phase of escalation that tested the endurance of both attackers and defenders. From 10th of March onward, Operation Frühlingserwachen pressed forward under increasingly difficult circumstances. The 6th SS Panzer Army, still leading the main thrust north of Lake Balaton, struggled to maintain momentum as Soviet defenses stiffened and supply problems mounted. The initial territorial gains of the first days gave way to slower progress, measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. Terrain remained a constant adversary. The early spring thaw had saturated fields, turning them into expanses of mud that swallowed men and machines alike. Heavy Tiger II tanks, weighing nearly 70 tons, were particularly ill-suited to the marshy ground. Reports from unit diaries indicate that entire platoons became immobilized when vehicles slid off causeways or became stuck in swampy meadows. Recovery equipment was limited, forcing crews to abandon tanks that could not be pulled free. The practical effect was a steady attrition of Germany's most valuable armored assets, not from Soviet fire, but from the environment itself. Soviet forces exploited these difficulties by intensifying artillery and counterattacks. Units of the 4th Guards Army and 26th Army had withdrawn in good order, preserving strength for defensive battles deeper in the prepared zones. Soviet commanders concentrated artillery along the Sarviz Canal, creating defensive fire belts that blunted successive German thrusts. In some cases, German units broke through the first line of defenses, only to encounter another fortified line reinforced by fresh troops. The Soviet practice of constructing defense in depth forced the Germans into grinding battles over villages, canals, and ridges, none of which yielded strategic breakthroughs. Logistics increasingly constrained German operations. Fuel shortages meant that armored units could not always attack in coordination with infantry. Some reports from the Leibstandarte division described tanks halting mid-operation to wait for fuel convoys, which themselves were vulnerable to Soviet air attacks. Ammunition shortages also became evident, particularly for heavy artillery and anti-tank guns. Hitler's directive forbidding withdrawal exacerbated these difficulties, as units were forced to hold exposed positions until supplies arrived, often at high cost. Civilian populations in western Hungary experienced the escalation directly. Villages in contested areas were subjected to shelling and aerial bombardment as control shifted back and forth. Civilians were pressed into labor by both sides, digging trenches, repairing roads, or clearing obstacles. Refugee flows increased as families attempted to escape the fighting, though many were trapped between front lines. The local economy, already strained by years of war, collapsed further as livestock was requisitioned and crops destroyed. For those caught in the path of advancing German armor or Soviet counterattacks, survival often meant abandoning homes entirely. The Hungarian Third Army, positioned on the southern sector of the front, attempted to support the German drive toward Nagy Kanisa and its oil fields. However, these formations were understrength and poorly equipped compared to both German and Soviet forces. Hungarian units often found themselves holding extended lines with inadequate artillery support. When Soviet forces launched local counterattacks, Hungarian divisions absorbed disproportionate casualties, further weakening the Axis flank. Internationally, the offensive did not go unnoticed. Allied intelligence monitored reports of heavy German concentrations in Hungary and correctly assessed that the operation aimed to protect oil resources. Western analysts noted the presence of elite Waffen-SS divisions, transferred from the Ardennes, as evidence that Germany was willing to risk its last reserves in the region. However, by mid-March, reports of stalled progress suggested that the offensive was unlikely to alter the broader strategic balance. For the German High Command, the situation became increasingly tense. Hitler demanded continued progress despite field reports of mounting difficulties. Commanders in the 6th SS Panzer Army and 6th Army requested permission to regroup or shift their axes of attack, but orders from Berlin emphasized persistence and strict adherence to the original plan. This rigidity undermined flexibility on the battlefield, preventing local commanders from adapting to conditions as they deteriorated. By 12-13 March, Soviet reserves were beginning to move into action. Mechanized corps held behind the front lines now advanced toward threatened sectors, preparing for counteroffensives once German momentum faltered. The Soviet 9th Guards Army, held in operational reserve, was deployed into positions where it could launch decisive strikes against exhausted German formations. The stage was thus set for the battle to reach its peak, with both sides committing additional forces and the outcome increasingly determined by attrition and endurance rather than maneuver. The escalation of the Battle of Lake Balaton highlighted the underlying imbalance of resources and logistics. German forces could still deliver powerful local blows, but sustaining them proved impossible against Soviet depth, artillery density, and air superiority. Civilians bore the brunt of renewed destruction, while both armies absorbed mounting casualties in a campaign whose stakes were high, but whose prospects of success were narrowing by the day. The next phase would see the battle reach its most intense stage, as German divisions pushed forward under increasingly unsustainable conditions, and Soviet countermeasures gathered strength for decisive confrontation. The Battle of Lake Balaton reached its peak between 14 and 16th of March 1945, when both sides committed the maximum strength available to them, and the fighting escalated into a decisive confrontation. The German 6th SS Panzer Army continued its effort to break through Soviet defenses near Székesfehérvár, supported by the 6th Army to the south. Hitler's instructions remained unchanged: no withdrawals, continued pressure, and complete faith in the capacity of elite SS divisions to achieve results. On the ground, however, commanders faced mounting challenges that increasingly made success impossible. By mid-March, the Germans had deployed nearly all of their available armored assets into the offensive. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitlerjugend, Das Reich, and Hohenstaufen divisions were at the center of the thrust, supported by heavy tank battalions armed with Tiger IIs. These formations, though formidable on paper, were depleted by constant combat and by the logistical strain of operating in muddy terrain. Reports from divisional war diaries indicate that many tanks were immobilized due to mechanical breakdowns, lack of fuel, or simply becoming stuck in marshland. Crews sometimes abandoned vehicles intact rather than risk encirclement. The Soviets, anticipating the culmination of the German offensive, had strengthened their defensive belts with additional artillery, minefields, and reserves. The Third Ukrainian Front now committed the 9th Guards Army, a formation of experienced troops transferred from the Stavka Reserve. Supported by mechanized corps, these units reinforced weak points and prepared for counteroffensive action. The density of Soviet artillery reached levels comparable to those seen in earlier decisive battles, with hundreds of guns per kilometer on threatened sectors. Soviet air support, particularly Il-2 Sturmovix, operated continuously against German supply lines and armored concentrations. The battle around Székesfehérvár illustrates the scale of combat at this stage. German forces succeeded in pushing into the outskirts of the town, but Soviet counterattacks quickly contained the advance. Street fighting broke out in villages along the approaches, with control shifting repeatedly as infantry and armor clashed at close quarters. Each gain by German forces came at high cost, and Soviet units consistently re-established new defensive lines. The effect was to slow the offensive to a crawl while steadily draining German strength. To the south, attempts by the German 6th Army and Hungarian units to secure the approaches to Nagy Kanizsa also stalled. The Hungarian 3rd Army bore heavy losses as it tried to maintain extended flanks under Soviet pressure. With limited artillery and outdated equipment, Hungarian units were often forced to retreat under heavy fire, exposing German divisions to encirclement risks. Coordination between German and Hungarian commands was strained, as each sought to preserve its own formations in the face of relentless Soviet countermeasures. Casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. German records from mid-March indicate daily losses of several hundred men per division, while Soviet reports also record significant casualties due to concentrated German armored attacks and artillery fire. The difference lay in reserves. The Red Army could rotate units and replenish formations from deep resources, while the Germans lacked both replacements and supplies. Every tank lost by the 6th SS Panzer Army represented a permanent reduction in striking power. Civilians in the region endured severe hardship during these peak days of fighting. Villages became battlegrounds, their inhabitants forced into cellars or driven into the countryside. Fields were ruined by the passage of heavy armor. Livestock was seized for rations, and artillery fire destroyed homes and infrastructure. For many Hungarians, the fighting around Lake Balaton was the second major battle in just a few months, following the devastation of the siege of Budapest. Within German high command, frustration grew. Reports from the front made clear that progress was minimal and that Soviet defenses remained intact. Yet Hitler continued to demand perseverance, convinced that oil fields had to be secured and that Soviet forces could still be dislodged. This insistence tied commanders' hands, preventing them from adjusting objectives or regrouping forces. At the same time, Soviet command under Marshal Tolbukin prepared to shift from defense to offense, confident that German momentum was exhausted. By 16th of March, the offensive had reached its natural limit. German divisions remained in contact with Soviet forces, but the tempo of attacks slowed markedly. Fuel shortages left armored units immobile, and artillery ammunition was rationed. Soviet reserves were now fully in place, ready to launch large-scale counteroffensives. What had been conceived as Hitler's last major gamble had consumed the strength of some of Germany's best divisions, without securing decisive gains. The peak of the Battle of Lake Balaton thus demonstrated the last concentrated offensive effort of the German armed forces in the East. It revealed both the continued combat capacity of elite units and the overwhelming strategic advantage of the Red Army in 1945. For the soldiers and civilians on the ground, it was a period of unrelenting violence and destruction, marking the culmination of the campaign before the balance of initiative shifted definitively toward the Soviet counterstroke. As German momentum faded after 16th of March, the nature of the fighting around Lake Balaton shifted from offensive thrusts to desperate resistance and adaptation. The 6th SS Panzer Army and supporting formations were forced into defensive postures, holding exposed salients against increasingly confident Soviet counterattacks. German commanders sought to stabilize their front lines, conserve fuel, and reorganize depleted divisions, but conditions left little room for flexibility. The Red Army, meanwhile, adjusted quickly to the changing situation, preparing to turn the failed offensive into an opportunity for decisive gains. German adaptation focused on improvisation under resource scarcity. Tank crews, unable to rely on consistent fuel deliveries, positioned their vehicles in static defensive roles, using Panthers and Tigers as mobile bunkers. Infantry dug into improvised trenches along canal lines and village perimeters. Artillery batteries shifted positions frequently to conserve shells and avoid counter-battery fire, sometimes firing only a handful of rounds per day. Reports from the Leibstandarte division describe crews stripping parts from disabled tanks to keep a few machines operational, while infantry battalions were merged due to mounting casualties. On the Soviet side, adaptation meant exploiting depth and reserves. Tolbuchen's command moved additional mechanized and guards units into sectors where German pressure was weakest. Soviet engineers laid pontoon bridges across canals, enabling tanks and self-propelled guns to maneuver more freely. Logistics officers ensured a steady flow of ammunition and fuel forward, relying on both rail lines repaired after the Budapest campaign and American-supplied trucks from Lend-Lease stock. The ability to sustain large-scale operations gave the Red Army a decisive advantage in both tempo and morale. Civilian experiences reflected this phase of the battle as much as military reports. Many Hungarian villagers found themselves caught between shifting lines, pressed first into labor by retreating German forces and then again by advancing Soviet units. Civilians were required to repair roads or carry supplies, often under shell fire. Entire communities were displaced, moving westward in search of safety. For local populations, the tactical adjustments of armies translated into daily uncertainty, hunger, and exposure to renewed destruction. Morale diverged sharply between the two sides. German soldiers, especially within the Waffen-SS divisions, maintained discipline, but recognized that their offensive goals were unattainable. Diaries and letters reveal growing frustration at the terrain, shortages, and relentless Soviet artillery. Some accounts speak of units ordered to hold villages until the last round, despite being surrounded. Conversely, Soviet morale rose steadily. The ability to halt Germany's last major offensive, combined with clear evidence that the enemy was weakening, reinforced confidence. Political officers emphasized that victory in Hungary would open the road to Vienna and accelerate the end of the war. Resistance took many forms. German forces continued to launch limited counterattacks to retake lost ground or delay Soviet advances, often at night to reduce exposure to air power. These actions inflicted local damage but did little to change the strategic situation. Soviet forces, for their part, tested German defenses with probing attacks, gradually expanding control over key crossroads, bridges, and ridgelines. Partisan activity in the rear also disrupted German supply routes, forcing additional resources into security duties. By the third week of March, the character of the battle was clear. German units were no longer pressing forward, but struggling to adapt to containment, while Soviet formations consolidated their strength for a decisive counterstroke. The shift from offense to defense marked a critical turning point. What had begun as Hitler's bid to regain initiative in Hungary had become, for German commanders, a fight to prevent collapse. The Red Army, by contrast, saw the failed German offensive as confirmation of their superiority and prepared to exploit it fully in the days to come. The decisive turning point of the Battle of Lake Balaton came on the 16th of March 1945, when the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front launched its counteroffensive against exhausted German formations. Marshal Fyodor Tolbuchin had patiently waited until the 6th SS Panzer Army's thrusts lost momentum. With reserves assembled and artillery massed, the Red Army struck across a broad front, transforming the battlefield from a contested offensive into a Soviet advance. The counterattack began with an intense artillery barrage that pounded German and Hungarian positions along the Sarviz Canal and beyond Székesfehérvár. Hundreds of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers saturated defensive lines, targeting command posts and concentrations of armor. German units, already weakened by fuel shortages and attrition, were unable to withstand the scale of bombardment. Soviet infantry and mechanized forces moved forward quickly behind the artillery curtain, overrunning outposts and forcing German troops back from their forward positions. The 9th Guards Army played a central role in the breakthrough. Supported by mechanized corps, it attacked the weakened flanks of the German salient, threatening encirclement of formations still engaged near Székesfehérvár. At the same time, the 26th and 27th Armies pressed forward in coordinated assaults, widening breaches and seizing control of key villages and road junctions. Soviet armor, particularly T-34-85s and IS-2 heavy tanks, advanced in massed formations that German defenders could not counter effectively. Immobilized Tiger IIs, stranded by mud or lack of fuel, were often destroyed in place by artillery or abandoned intact. Hungarian units, stretched thin and under-equipped, collapsed rapidly under the weight of Soviet attacks. The Hungarian Third Army suffered heavy losses, with some divisions reduced to fragments within days. German forces attempted to reinforce the sector, but shortages of men and equipment limited their capacity. Coordination between German and Hungarian commands broke down as communication lines failed and units were overrun. The air war further tilted the balance. The Soviet 17th Air Army achieved near total control of the skies, launching continuous sorties against German supply routes and defensive strongpoints. Il-2 Sturmovix struck immobilized tanks and columns of retreating vehicles, while fighters intercepted the limited Luftwaffe presence. German air units, restricted by fuel shortages and attrition, could offer only sporadic resistance. Civilians experienced the turning point as another wave of upheaval. Villages on the advancing Soviet axis were shelled and contested, forcing inhabitants to flee or hide in cellars. German forces retreating through these areas requisitioned carts and livestock, while Soviet troops requisitioned food supplies as they advanced. For many civilians, the transition from German to Soviet control meant sudden displacement, destruction of property, and uncertainty over the future. Within days of the Soviet counteroffensive, the scale of German failure became evident. The 6th SS Panzer Army, once considered the strongest armored formation available to Hitler, was driven back in disorder. Units that had been committed to the offensive now fought desperately to hold defensive lines and avoid encirclement. Reports from German divisional headquarters acknowledged that fuel and ammunition were nearly depleted, morale was faltering, and losses in both men and equipment were irreplaceable. The turning point of the battle was not marked by a single encirclement or spectacular maneuver, but by the systematic collapse of German offensive capacity. Once Soviet reserves entered the field, the balance shifted decisively. What had been conceived as Hitler's last gamble to protect Hungary's oil resources and delay Soviet advances into Austria now became a rapid retreat under overwhelming pressure. By the end of March, Soviet forces had secured Székesfehérvár, driven German divisions back toward the Austrian border, and opened the way for the Vienna offensive. The German High Command could no longer deny that the last major offensive of the war had failed. For soldiers on the ground, the turning point was unmistakable. The initiative had passed irreversibly to the Red Army, and the possibility of holding Hungary was gone. By late March 1945, the German offensive around Lake Balaton had collapsed entirely, and the battle entered its final phase of withdrawal and disintegration. The Red Army, having repelled the thrust of the 6th SS Panzer Army and launched its counteroffensive, steadily pushed westward. German formations, exhausted by weeks of combat, shortages, and constant Soviet pressure, fell back in increasingly disorganized fashion. The Third Ukrainian Front advanced rapidly after 20th of March, exploiting the weakness of German defenses. Székesfehérvár, once a central objective of the German attack, fell firmly under Soviet control as counterattacks failed. Soviet mechanized and guards units pressed through breaches, pursuing retreating German and Hungarian divisions. The Sarviz Canal line, once fiercely contested, was abandoned as Soviet forces advanced beyond it. German divisions that had once been on the offensive now fought desperate rearguard actions, buying time for withdrawals but unable to hold territory. Losses mounted heavily. German armored divisions, particularly the Waffen-SS units, reported catastrophic reductions. The Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and Hitlerjugend divisions, for example, each had only a fraction of their original tanks operational by the end of March. Infantry battalions were reduced to company strength. Ammunition shortages forced artillery units to ration fire, while fuel scarcity immobilized many vehicles, which were then destroyed or abandoned to prevent capture. Soviet reports counted dozens of intact German tanks left behind in the mud, a testament to the logistical collapse. The Hungarian Third Army suffered even more severely. Already under-equipped at the beginning of the offensive, Hungarian divisions disintegrated under the strain of Soviet advances. Some formations ceased to exist as coherent units, with remnants absorbed into German commands or dispersed in the countryside. For Hungary, the battle marked the effective end of its capacity to continue as a meaningful military ally of Germany. Civilians experienced the aftermath as a period of chaos. Refugees streamed westward, joining columns of retreating soldiers, carts, and livestock. Many villages were left destroyed or abandoned, with infrastructure ruined by artillery and tank battles. The agricultural heartland of Western Hungary, already strained, now lay in ruins. Those who remained faced requisitions from both retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. Local populations endured not only material loss, but also the uncertainty of shifting control as front lines moved rapidly through the region. For the German High Command, the situation became untenable. Reports from Army Group South indicated that units were no longer capable of coordinated defense. Requests for withdrawal to prepared positions closer to Austria were finally approved, though Hitler continued to issue unrealistic orders demanding counterattacks. In practice, commanders on the ground prioritized survival, retreating toward defensive positions in Austria. On the Soviet side, the victory opened the path for further operations. The capture of Western Hungary enabled the Red Army to launch the Vienna offensive in early April. With the goal of seizing the Austrian capital, Soviet forces were able to redeploy quickly thanks to their logistical preparations, while German and Hungarian remnants struggled to establish new defensive lines. The withdrawal phase also witnessed numerous reprisals and humanitarian crises. Villages suspected of collaboration faced punitive measures, while civilians accused of aiding German forces were deported or imprisoned. At the same time, displaced persons and prisoners of war crowded temporary camps established by Soviet authorities. The destruction of farmland and infrastructure deepened food shortages, leaving the civilian population vulnerable to famine conditions. By the end of March 1945, the German presence in Hungary had been reduced to fragments retreating westward. The Battle of Lake Balaton, intended as a last gamble to secure vital oil fields and halt the Soviet advance, ended in failure and retreat. For the Axis, it marked the loss of Hungary as both an ally and a resource base. For the Soviets, it marked another step in the march toward Vienna and the final stages of the war in Central Europe. The aftermath left behind shattered armies, devastated communities, and a landscape scarred by one of the last major offensives of the Second World War. The Battle of Lake Balaton, fought in March 1945, holds a particular place in the history of the Second World War as the last large-scale German offensive on the Eastern Front and one of the final efforts to influence the course of the conflict through decisive operations. Its legacy lies not only in the immediate military consequences, but also in the broader political, economic, and cultural significance it carried for Hungary, Germany, the Soviet Union, and post-war Europe. From a military standpoint, the offensive demonstrated both the residual strength and the fatal limitations of German forces at the end of the war. The commitment of the 6th SS Panzer Army, with some of the most experienced and heavily armed divisions remaining in German service, showed that the Wehrmacht could still mount powerful attacks. Yet the outcome revealed the structural collapse of Germany's war-making capacity. Logistical failures, fuel shortages, and the inability to sustain prolonged offensives illustrated the erosion of Germany's resources. The offensive consumed equipment and personnel that could not be replaced, weakening formations that would soon face the Soviet drive into Austria. For the Soviet Union, the battle reinforced its dominance on the Eastern Front. The ability of the Third Ukrainian Front to absorb and repel an offensive by Germany's strongest remaining armored units underscored the Red Army's operational superiority in 1945. The rapid transition from defense to counteroffensive highlighted Soviet command confidence, logistical organization, and depth of reserves. Politically, victory at Lake Balaton paved the way for the Vienna offensive, enabling Soviet forces to secure Austria before Western allies could advance from the west. This established conditions for Soviet influence in Central Europe, shaping the balance of power in the post-war settlement. Hungary's role in the battle carried long-lasting consequences. The Arrow Cross regime, under Ferenc Szalasi, had aligned itself with German strategic objectives, committing Hungarian forces to operations that overstretched their capabilities. The destruction of the Hungarian Third Army during the battle effectively ended Hungary's capacity to act as a meaningful military partner. The devastation of Western Hungary, fields destroyed, villages ruined, populations displaced, deepened the country's wartime suffering and set the stage for post-war reconstruction under Soviet occupation. The oil fields at Nagy Kaniza, so central to Hitler's calculations, fell into Soviet hands, ensuring that Germany's last hope for indigenous fuel supplies was extinguished. Internationally, the failure of Operation Frühlingserwachen confirmed to Allied observers that Germany was no longer capable of significant recovery on the Eastern Front. Reports from the period emphasized that the commitment of elite SS formations in Hungary had ended in defeat, leaving the Wehrmacht unable to mount further large-scale offensives. This strengthened the view in London and Washington that the war in Europe was entering its final weeks. It also reinforced perceptions of the Soviet Union as the decisive military power in Eastern and Central Europe. In cultural memory, the battle became symbolic of both futility and transition. For German veterans, it represented the last time large armored formations were employed in an offensive role, remembered as a costly effort against impossible odds. For Soviet veterans, it was a testament to the resilience and superiority of the Red Army in the final stage of the war. In Hungary, memories of the battle were shaped by displacement, destruction, and the collapse of sovereignty, overshadowed by the broader trauma of wartime occupation and the imposition of post-war regimes. Historians continue to debate aspects of the battle's significance. Some emphasize the flawed strategic logic of committing scarce resources to an offensive with little chance of success, seeing it as an example of Hitler's rigid decision-making. Others note that even in defeat, the Germans demonstrated tactical competence and inflicted substantial casualties on Soviet forces. What is generally agreed, however, is that the battle marked the effective end of German operational initiative in the East. From that point onward, Germany's role was reduced to defensive withdrawals until final defeat in May. The legacy of Lake Balaton is therefore twofold. In immediate terms, it was a failed offensive that hastened the collapse of German defenses in Central Europe and opened the path to Vienna. In broader terms, it symbolized the exhaustion of German power and the ascendancy of Soviet influence in the region. The devastation left behind, burned villages, abandoned tanks, shattered armies, was a visible reminder of how the final months of the war consumed resources and lives without altering the inevitable outcome. Today, the Battle of Lake Balaton is studied as a case of late-war strategic miscalculation, the intersection of dwindling resources with high political stakes, and the demonstration of Soviet resilience at the threshold of victory. Its legacy lies less in territorial change than in what it revealed, that even Germany's last gamble, employing its most elite units, could not prevent the collapse of the Eastern Front or alter the course of European history.